When we think about the book of Ruth, I've always looked at that book as a very positive book, and yet it's written in a time where it's a very dark time, I think, in the lives of the Israelites. It may be up to almost 400 years when we have the judges ruling in Israel. They didn't have kings. You don't find of a lot of prophets running around telling people the will of God. Not a lot of visions are taking place, and not a lot of contact with God. As the last verse of the book of Judges tells us, they had no king in Israel, so every man did what was right in his own eyes, and that can be confusion. That can be going different ways. And when we open the book of Ruth, the very first verse tells us that the events that we see in this book were happening in the days of the judges. And it was at one of those times where God had raised up a judge to defeat the enemy, and they were not being oppressed. Very well could be. What is interesting is that Naomi and her family, husband and 2 sons, because of a famine, they go to Moab. This is what I mean, it's dark, because Moab is an idolatrous people. In fact, in Judges 10 and verse 6, you'll find the Israelites start serving the gods of Moab and Baal and all of the different idols that were involved with the people in that region. And so here they go to a land of idolatry. That's a dark time. It's a famine time. It's a death time. And in these circumstances, I think we can learn a lot about character, and we're going to observe 2 women from the first chapter of Ruth that are exemplary, that we can learn some things from, that went through difficult times, times that maybe you haven't experienced yet, and it would be very difficult. How should we react in such dark times? What should we be thinking about God? Is He sovereign? Is there any such thing as the providence of God? What is He working in my life when I'm just an ordinary person? Is there anything great that can come from my ordinary life in serving God? We'll answer those questions in the book of Ruth. We're going to examine these 2 ladies this evening. We think about Naomi. I paint her picture with misery. She is going through misery. In this first chapter, she loses her husband to death. And not only that, she loses her 2 sons to death. They married women from Moab, and both of them died. And within a decade, 10-year period, she lost her husband, 1 son, and 2 sons. Add to that the famine that they've experienced. That's what drove them to the land of Moab. There indeed was a famine in the land of Israel that caused her husband to have to move his family. So here is death added to famine. Can you take much more? Does God have anything to do with that? And when we see this taking place, we see how Naomi is involved in reacting to this. Verse 11 of the first chapter. When she is seeing her circumstances, she says, "Turn again, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight, and should also bear sons, would you tarry till they were grown up or grown? Would ye therefore stay from having husbands, nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes, for the hand of Jehovah is gone forth against me." I don't know if you agree with her theology. We'll talk about it more. But she looked at this, the hand of God's against me. I don't have anything to offer you. Orpah and Ruth, I'm empty. I can understand her feelings. She is being honest with what she sees as her reality, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better. Have you ever been there? Things are so dark, things are so difficult, that you just say, I don't have anything to offer. You surely don't want to be around me. But also observe her understanding of God's sovereignty. When she says, would you tarry here? And she says in verse 13, Jehovah is gone forth against me. Do you believe that? I do. God is a sovereign God. Now that doesn't mean he wills things to happen, but he's over it. He could stop anything. And when we read in the Bible, and she will understand this about why are they going back to their hometown? Notice in chapter 1 and verse 6, she arose with her daughters that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard of the country of Moab, how that Jehovah had visited his people in giving them bread. Can you take that side of God's sovereignty and his providence? He gives us bread, but he doesn't give us famine. You take one side of that, not the other? I can't. Why do you think he gave the famine? Why do you think the famine occurred? Think God had anything to do with that? You think he was sovereign over that, or maybe he's not? He just gives us bread. That's the way we like to think of God. He's always doing me good. I never have to go through misery. God is sovereign. And so many times in the Old Testament, when people went away from God, he brought famine to their land. And he's in charge. When she says God's hand is against me, she's just looking at famine, death of my husband, and 2 sons. She's just doing what Ecclesiastes says, in the days of prosperity rejoice. She doesn't have many of them. In the days of adversity, consider. You're in control, God, still. Have I done wrong? Whatever it is, God, you're against me. There's something here because this is what's happened, and I know it's under your rule. That's the way she felt about it. And it's hard for me to take one side of his sovereignty and not all of it. Thirdly, her hopelessness. There's no husbands in her womb, but there was an Israelite law that we find in Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10, that if the husband dies, the nearest kin could be involved in raising up children to the honor of that dead brother. She doesn't see that at all, but you and I do. Because back in the hometown where they were from, in that area, there is a Boaz waiting in the wings. And here we begin to see is God's sovereignty and all of his providence. She doesn't see this yet. She doesn't think about Boaz. She doesn't know about Boaz. But she's involved and going to learn about Boaz. But right now, it's just hopeless. And we must realize that here is God in rule, in charge of everything. He's going to bring her to that place of happiness for her and her family. Because there is a Boaz, a nearest kin, and she doesn't think that. Do we not overestimate our dreary times? Do not we kind of overplay them that we forget that there may be some still hope left? We don't see it. It's just dark. There's no way. I have nothing to offer you. Stay here. I don't have anything back home. I don't have anything in my future. There's no way that I'm going to be involved in having children come into my family. And you overestimate how dark the darkness is. Because behind the darkness is the smiling face of God's providence. And in times of misery, we don't see that. But God is indeed in charge. And we find, as we get to chapter 2 and verse 20, she's going to realize this. Naomi said to her daughter-in-laws, "Blessed be he of Jehovah, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and the dead." And Naomi said unto her, "A man is nigh of kin unto us, one of our near kinsmen." Jehovah's behind this. That never leaves the mind of Naomi. In all of her misery, she looks at it as, God's against me right now. But then she learns there is Boaz. And she's involved in realizing that. And what happens in chapter 4 and verse 20? That because of this near kinsman of Boaz, who marries Ruth, Boaz beget Obed. Obed beget Jesse. Jesse beget David. Naomi is going to beholding the grandfather of David. Does God do marvelous things in ordinary lives? Naomi doesn't have anything going for her. And yet God's sovereignty is over it all, and his providence is going to bring about the lineage that will lead to the great King David. Naomi, why are you bitter? Because you're in misery. I understand that. But sometimes we don't see, in all of our hopelessness, a sovereign God working things out for our good. What about Ruth? I think you could describe Ruth as being faithful. She's going to be faithful to her newfound God, Jehovah. She's from idolatrous Moab, but she's faithful to her mother-in-law. And I think one of the great purposes of painting the dark picture of Naomi, how she feels about things, and what happens in these verses with the other daughter-in-law, is to show you how faithful Ruth is. When he says in verse 14, they lifted up their voice and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her. Do you blame Orpah of going to stay in her home? Naomi had nothing to offer her, had no husband. You want to wait till one gets 20 years old? 18, 20 years old? No. I don't have anything to offer you. Orpah stays home. Ruth clave to her. And she said, "Behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people and unto her God. Return thou after thy sister-in-law." I look at that and I thought, Ruth, how could you ever encourage them to go back to idolatry? Ruth lived in these times when idolatry was all around them. And maybe that wasn't a big deal to them, but it's a stumbling block to Israel. And time again, the lives of the judges, that's what was their downfall. He said, go back to your idols. But go with her. And Ruth said, entreat me not to leave thee. Don't you beg me to do that. And return from following after thee, for whether thou goest, I will go. And where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest, note this, will I die, and there will I be buried. Jehovah, do so to me, and more so, if aught but death part thee and me. That's faithfulness to her mother-in-law. We don't sing this song much anymore at weddings, but the words of this song was sung at my wedding, and Kathy has gone with me wherever I went. She's moved with me. She's been faithful to me. But would you be faithful to your mother-in-law? Ruth was. even past the commitment of marriage. What happens when your husband dies? Maybe you want to go back home. You've been moving here, moving there, moving there. I want to get back home, especially preachers' lives. Like she wants to get back home where her family was. Ruth says, where you die, I'll die. She's not going back to Moab at all. There's that commitment. There is that faithfulness. And she's not going to be involved with idolatry. Jehovah is my God, and I'm going to commit myself to you. The only thing that's going to separate us is death. I'm going to die where you die. I'm going to go where you go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. There is a faithful soul. That is a noble woman. That's a character that we need to emulate in our lives. But look at her character further. She had a faith in God to look beyond the setbacks. She can make her commitment, unseen, not knowing where she's going. But she looked beyond the setbacks. There's been the death of her husband, the death of her father-in-law, death of her brother-in-law. There's been one setback after setback, and now she's launching out in faith. She's faithful, going to be faithful to God, that she can look beyond the setbacks. Can you look beyond the setbacks in your life? Or do you kind of dwell on them? I just can't get ahead. I do this, and here's 2 steps backward. Woe is me. Faith allows you to keep looking at God and trusting in His sovereignty and His providence. That's what these characteristics of these 2 ladies need to be in our mind, because I think sometimes we don't believe in God's sovereignty, don't trust in His providence, can't see it as we should. But not only she had faith in God that allowed her to look beyond the setbacks, but she was free. Do you have to have security where you're going? I don't think we've been promised that. I'm going anyway. Are there any comforts back there that we're going to, Naomi? I can't promise that. I learned that God has blessed the land with bread. But other than that, I don't make any promises. I'm going anyway. You know what faith in God allows you? It allows you to be free to make those moves. Always trusting in His sovereignty. She had the courage to venture into the unknown. Those weren't her people. They're going to be her people. That's not her land. She didn't know what it's going to be like. She's courageous. Would you have that kind of courage? Or would we try to encourage our daughters or our son, now you get things secure there before you move your family? And there's some wisdom in all that. And I want you to have the comfort set there, and I want you to kind of know what it's all about before you make that kind of commitment. Ruth didn't have the time. All she did was trust in God. And with Orpah staying there, we can understand that. But her faith in God gave her the freedom. I don't have to have these promises set. I'm going with you. And I will venture into that unknown. And she made a very radical commitment. I will be buried where you're buried. I'm not going back home. And that's what faith does. It allows us to look beyond the circumstances and see God, trusting God, He will take care of me. Now, it doesn't mean I don't make wise decisions, but all she had was Naomi. And Naomi, all she had, I'm going back home. I think there's bread there now. That's all they had promised to them. And so we find that's a wonderful character of faith. Now, I want to draw some lessons. God's providence. We know, well, He's looking over me. He's providing for me. He'll end up in my good, for my good. There's that side of providence, but we've got to get the other side. Naomi knew the life of Joseph. And what we see in the life of Joseph is providence of God. Where in Genesis 15, verse 20, when his brothers meant it for evil, God meant what? For good. God meant it all to your misery, Joseph. All of those dark days in the dungeon, Joseph. The moment you thought you're getting out, they forgot about you, Joseph. Your brothers left you to die, Joseph. They sold you into slavery, Joseph. Potiphar's wife lied about you, Joseph. It's that part of God's providence that we don't want to dwell on. Oh, he provided for me. I got a check in the mail. Don't know where it came from, but isn't God's providence wonderful? Yes, it's wonderful. But there is an evil side of providence that you have to go through many times. That's what Naomi couldn't see. There's a lesson for us. I don't think we see it either. All we see, everybody's against me. Everything's against me. Jehovah is against me. And all the while, through those dark times, God is working for our good in the worst of times. Because God is bringing all these things about. The nearest kinsman, the lineage of David. And we need to remember there is that side. And faithfulness to God should never cease. Because we have these promises. In Psalm 34, in verse 19, we read where God's relationship to the righteous. Jehovah is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as are of a contrite spirit. Verse 19, many are the afflictions of the righteous. Did you hear that? Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but Jehovah delivereth him out of all of them. He's working his providential care. He's planning ahead. And he's a sovereign God that can make it happen. We need to remember in our dark hours that God's still in control. And behind this dark cloud of frowns is the smiling face of God, working things out for our good. Secondly, I think with Naomi is something that I think we see in a lot of times in calamities, that relationships are more important than things, than circumstances that happen in our lives. And I think we see this with Naomi in chapter 1 and verse 21, when she says, I went out full, and Jehovah hath brought me home again. See, he's involved in their lives, empty. Why call ye me Naomi, mean pleasant? Saying Jehovah had testified against me, the Almighty hath afflicted me. I'm going through this dark time. You call me bitter, not Naomi, pleasant. I went out full. I thought a famine drove you out. I'm coming back empty. I thought you heard bread was in the land. That doesn't make sense until you get a hold of this point. She went out full because she had a husband and 2 sons. She came back empty because she lost them. It wasn't about bread. It wasn't about famine. It's about relationships. And we are warned of God not to put relationships above the truth. I understand that. But having faith in God, when they stick a microphone in your face and you've just had your tornado just take away your house, but your family was saved. Hope you can realize that here I'm still full. Circumstances don't determine my emptiness, because I still have my loved ones. Naomi knew that. Otherwise, that verse doesn't make sense. You went out full, you're hungry, a famine. You came back empty, there's bread in the land now. She didn't have her loved ones. Thirdly, God's sovereignty prevails in our ordinary lives. It's not something, it's a miracle. It's a miraculous thing. It's astonishing things. Just ordinary things happen in our ordinary lives, but His sovereignty is prevailing. And we see this in Daniel especially. In Daniel, the 2nd chapter, and this may be more glorious because it deals with the kingdoms and the kings of mankind, and all the nations around us. But Daniel, the 2nd chapter, verse 21, Daniel is blessing Jehovah and praising Him. He says, He changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom and the wise and knowledge to them that have understanding. It wasn't Daniel, it's God blessing him to have the wisdom in this context. But He changes the times. You think about, times are changing, aren't they? Things are different. Things seem to be a little darker sometimes than they have been. God must not be in control. God is in control. He changes the seasons. We just got to be sitting here. I'm going to consider some things. It may be me. It may be about my neighbors. It may be our country. It may be forgetting God. He's allowing these changing. He'll set up kings and He'll take down kings. And we thought it was just a popular vote in the electoral college, maybe. Things happen. Do you have that kind of belief in God's sovereignty? I think the Bible teaches that. In Daniel 4:35, King Nebuchadnezzar, at least for a moment, when he had his experience with God and His power, drove him out and eat like an ox. So all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing before God. He doeth according to His will in the army of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay His hand, or say unto Him, What doest thou? Nobody can stop Him. Do we have the idea that God just set everything in order and just sitting in heaven watching it unfold? God's in control. And He's in control of our ordinary lives. James tells us this. This is how we should live. In James, the 4th chapter, verse 14 and 15, you're busy making a living. You're busy moving here. You're busy to get gain. You're making your business deals. You're making your plans. Ordinary living. You know not what shall be on the morrow. But today you say, or tomorrow we'll go in this city, spend a year there, trade and get gain. You don't know what will be on tomorrow. And this is what arrests my attention. What is your life? For you're a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away. I understand that. For you ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall both live and do this or that. That's what gets my attention. If it just so happens, if it just so happens we'll both live and do this and that, no, if the Lord wills. You don't like that Lord willing stuff. We don't sometimes. Well, what if He wills that I don't live? He wills that you didn't live. He's in control. I think we need to come to that belief. And I know sometimes it could be a trite statement, overused. Every time you do things, Lord willing. But that should be in our minds, in our hearts. And it's something you ought to say, James says. I will live if the Lord wills. And it's very difficult sometimes to look at life and as it unfolds and how this happened and how that happened. But God's in control of it all. And sometimes we need to remember there is a dark miserable side of God's providential care for our good. I think that is a tremendous thing to keep in mind. And then finally, the freedom that I see in Ruth because of her faith, cause her to be free to choose things. The freedom of living that faith gives. I don't know what's ahead of me. I don't know where I'm going. That's Hebrews 11 and verse 8, when Abraham is described as being a man of faith. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed to go into a place where he was to receive for inheritance, and he went out not knowing whether he went. God had promised him, here's what I'm going to give this to you, but he didn't know where he's going. He's just walking by faith. And that is a kind of a freedom. I know I've talked to one couple here that they like to do their vacations and not plan it. That would drive my father mad. He plans any trip 4 or 5 days beforehand. He's got it ready to go. But I know of a couple here that they say, well, let's just we'll go on a little trip, and they decide, and I think there's more than one here that does this. I admire you. That we don't know where we're going, we just get in the car and go. Isn't that a wonderful freedom to have that? And just kind of go where we want to go and take this road or take that road. Now that can sometimes get you in trouble. That gets you on some roads you don't want to be on. But isn't that the experience? That's a great experience. And what we see is that that's the experience faith gives us. I know faith, God's in control. And especially when we realize, well, I'm thinking about moving over here. What good can I do? What can I accomplish there? I don't know, so I'm just going to stay put. No, faith in God gives you the freedom to make those decisions freely. God will take care of me. Let's see if it works out. Can I be encouragement to that church there? And can I glorify God? And I don't know what's going to work out, but I believe in God. God will take care of me. That's a wonderful way to live. That's Ruth. That's Ruth. Not knowing any security that lies ahead of her. She is free to make that type of commitment. And look where it led her. It led her to produce the granddaddy of King David. And here are these ordinary lives. God's providence worked out. And he is sovereign, and he is in control, and he's working out his providential care. And I hope we can, by faith, see that in our lives, that we've learned from these two wonderful women. This evening, if you're outside of Jesus Christ, Jesus came from the lineage of David. And all the while, God has his plans. Not David in Jerusalem, not Jesus sitting on David's throne in literal Jerusalem. But the blessings of David would be all summarized in Jesus Christ, in the fact that he's King of kings and Lord of lords. And he sits ruling in his kingdom today, inviting you to become part of his citizenry. By coming to Christ, you can have your sins forgiven. And having that faith that my sins are forgiven, you have the faith to start walking the life of a Christian. Not knowing, will I succeed or not? God's made provisions. When you fail, you can repent and pray. And get back on the road and just take it where it leads. I don't know exactly where heaven is. I think it's above. But I know that's where God is. That's where Jesus is. And my faith says, I will go where you lead me. And that's where my destiny is. And faith gives you the freedom to live for God and to go through the misery part of God's providence, but the freedom to choose and be committed to other people, because you've got the big things worked out. That you can even die where the place was that the one you committed to is going to die. That's no problem with you. One of the beautiful things about Jesus' resurrection is the first fruits of our own resurrection. And we're going to be raised from that grave. We're going to be raised incorruptible. We're going to have that glorious body. When the Lord comes, those of us living will be changed into that glorious body and ever be with the Lord. Faith gives you the whole picture, and it gives you the freedom to choose. And regardless of what men think, I'm going to serve my God, and we're going to serve others. And I'm going to look at God's providence, not with hopelessness, but just look for that smiling face above those dark clouds. I know He's there. And wait on the Lord. He'll bless you. That's a life to live, and we offer that in Jesus Christ. Come to Him now in obedience to His gospel as we stand and as we sing.